A few days ago, I reported on the news that yet another Bioware veteran developer was leaving the studio. This time it was none other than James Ohlen, who had been with the studio for 22 years and worked as lead designer for renowned titles such as Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, Neverwinter Nights, and Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, and he was also the director of Bioware's MMORPG Star Wars The Old Republic. He explained in a recent series of tweets that he needed to take a break from the industry to work on something smaller and more personal, and expressed that the most fun he had at Bioware was as lead designer for Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Nights. If you've been keeping up with Bioware news, then you'll know that James is part of a string of departures of key individuals who helped shape the studio into what it is today, with others who have exited, including lead animator Stephen Gilmore, lead writer Drew Karpashian, and Dragon Age creative director Mike Laidlaw, all of who left within the last year. Unsurprisingly, fans of Bioware are concerned that slowly but surely, the studio is beginning to lose its identity. They question whether Bioware will truly be able to be called Bioware when its insides continue to be replaced one piece at a time, fearing that the studio will suffer a similar fate to the likes of Bungie and Rare, who bear a familiar name and are wearing a familiar skin, but might as well be completely different studios than ones we grew up with from within. Now, these are all topics that came up in a recent interview that James participated in with website Game Informer, which was transcribed in an article published on July 23, 2018. There, James discussed the reasons behind why he left Bioware and shared his thoughts on some of the rumors and speculation surrounding the current state of the studio and its relationship with publisher EA. The interview began with James being asked how long he's been considering stepping away from Bioware and what led him to finally pull the trigger, to which he responded that he wanted to return to an environment where he could focus on designing stories, levels, worlds, and games rather than taking on managerial positions like he's been doing lately, noting how working with 50 to 100 people is a lot different than working with 500 to 1,000 people. James then expressed that having grown up with Bioware, it was hard for him to leave the company, but doesn't regret it. Moving on, James was asked why he left in the middle of Anthem's development if he was taking on a more hands-on creative role with that project, to which he responded that his role in Anthem wasn't actually that huge and that he had passed on his position of narrative director to someone else after about 6 months. Ultimately, it came down to him not wanting to take on more administrative or director of design type roles. He wanted to do creative work. James then expressed how liberating it was to be free of the expectations that come with managerial positions and to be able to focus on being creative, before being asked if Bioware's culture remains intact given the recent wave of departures. James responded that he believes the culture of humility and excellence is still there, that remaining veterans like Casey Hudson and Mark Dara are keeping the Bioware culture alive. He also touted how the mantra of quality in the workplace, quality in the product, and the pursuit of a good work environment that doesn't burn people out and focuses on creating the highest quality games possible still hold, though he did note that with games getting more expensive and teams getting larger, it's been difficult and Bioware's had to evolve. As admirable as it is for James to rally with his own brethren, for onlookers it could easily be argued that principles regarding quality in the workplace and the product have deteriorated. Jason Schreier's investigative report on Mass Effect Andromeda's troubled development history detailed that in-office politics was rampant and caused a lot of friction between Bioware's divisions and employees. As for quality, well, with their last few games coming nowhere near close to living up to the studio's best efforts, with Mass Effect Andromeda being a particularly disastrous venture. Forgive me if I'm not entirely sold on the notion that Bioware standards haven't been shaken. Technical issues aside, Andromeda's biggest problem was its unbearably dreadful writing and dialogue, and the fault there mainly lies with the studio. While EA played a part in the managerial incompetence that led to Andromeda's failure, to say Bioware didn't have something to do with it, especially in the writing department, would be naive. Granted, Andromeda was developed by the less experienced Bioware Montreal team, but if Jason's article is to be believed, most problems can be attributed to those in managerial positions. Andromeda's troubled development had less to do with the ground floor workers being less experienced, and more to do with poor planning from executives, producers, directors, and leads. So yeah, suffice to say that Andromeda's failure was hardly just a Bioware Montreal issue or just about inexperience. It was a systemic issue that stemmed from the core of both Bioware and EA's upper management. The interviewer then proceeded to ask what James attributes to be the cause for the recent talent bleed at Bioware, to which he basically said that once you've been in a studio for a very long time, sometimes you just need a change and want to do your own thing. He then highlighted how difficult it is to get your hands dirty and be creative when you're leading a team of 1,000 and are under pressure to deliver hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, as there are a lot of responsibilities that come with management roles that get in the way of being able to be part of the creative process. The comparison James made was that it's like being the captain of the Titanic. Because it's such a large ship with so many moving parts, there's a lot of manpower and resources that go into operating it, with the captain being able to steer it only so much on his own. This right here goes to show that bigger isn't always better for a game studio. There is such a thing as too many cooks in the kitchen. At some point, continuing to grow a team will be to the operation's detriment, not to its benefit. Sure, you can do more with a larger team, but everything's spread a lot thinner, and like James highlighted, department leads end up doing less creating and more managing as a result. James also emphasized the pressure of having to deliver hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, and that's one aspect that I think has killed a lot of studios, which buckled under the pressure of EA's lofty expectations. Visceral was one such victim, with EA expecting too much from the over-budgeted Dead Space 3 while intruding the creative process with forced implementation of microtransactions that played a key part in the title's underwhelming sales performance. The way EA dealt with that situation was to sideline Visceral by forcing upon them the development of Battlefield Hardline and intervening with the creative process of their single-player Star Wars game before finally pulling the plug on them. With Mass Effect Andromeda, despite its less than stellar critical reception, it actually managed to push a couple million copies and ultimately made some money back. But EA didn't deem that enough to keep Bioware Montreal afloat and sent the studio right to the chopping block instead. When teams are getting so big that the creative process gets lost in transition, and when publishers show so little regard for creative qualities in favor of sales figures and revenue, yeah, I can see how that might contribute to veteran developers getting burned out. From there, James was asked to shed some light on BioWare's current leadership and highlight key members who are making significant contributions to the company. Some developers he named include Kathleen Rootsert, lead writer on Anthem, Preston Watamaniuk, who's been at BioWare since Neverwinter Nights, Parrish Lay, a cinematic lead who worked on Mass Effect games and is working on key parts of Anthem, Chad Robertson, who's leading up BioWare Austin, and Chris King, who came on board during Andromeda's development and has a lot of experience with combat design. While I have no reason to doubt their individual talents, it worries me that James could only name one old-school BioWare veteran, Preston Watamaniuk, who was part of the design team for Neverwinter Nights, Knights of the Old Republic, and Jade Empire, and became lead designer for the original Mass Effect trilogy. Now, I'm well aware that BioWare developers won't live forever, that they'll eventually have to pass down the torch, but with so many veterans leaving during such precarious times and under such precarious circumstances, it can often feel less like they're passing the torch and more like they're jumping ship. Maybe this is just me, but the vibe I get is that veterans no longer recognize or are no longer enthused by what BioWare has become, and in turn prefer to move on to greener, more fulfilling pastures. Anyway, moving on, Game Informer shifted the conversation to discuss widespread sentiments among segments of the BioWare community that Anthem will be too far removed from what's expected from the studio, especially in light of news that things like romance and branching dialogue have been dumbed down or are completely absent. To that, James argued that what's allowed BioWare to survive for more than 2 decades is that they're not afraid to take risks and try new and different things, citing how just as Anthem is different from games like Dragon Age and Mass Effect, games like Neverwinter Nights from 2002 and Star Wars The Old Republic from 2011 were different from what came before them. but it's one thing to try something different, and it's another to stray from the path and get lost. Metal Gear Survive was a radical departure from a traditional Metal Gear game, but it was for all the wrong reasons. Not trying to say Anthem is anywhere near that level, all I'm saying is that there is a clear distinction between different and astray. There's a difference between taking risks and dumbing down key features. Even Neverwinter Nights and The Old Republic had dialogue options and felt like they had basic role-playing elements that you would associate with a Bioware title. Hell, The Old Republic, despite being an MMO, had romance options players could pursue. Anthem, on the other hand, seems to be limiting BioWare's hallmark traits in favor of flashy combat and a much stronger emphasis on multiplayer. The promise we were made was that Anthem could be played solo and evoke the feeling that you're playing a traditional BioWare game, but not only have marquee RPG features been neutered, developers also seem less confident now about claiming that Anthem can be played as if it were a single-player BioWare experience without compromises. When speaking to Game Informer, Michael Gamble recently said that while players aren't artificially limited from playing solo, the game is built to be played with friends. Sounds to me like they're backing away from the promise that single-player enthusiasts can have just as good of a time. James did assure, however, that just because BioWare is trying something different now doesn't mean they won't return to a more traditional style with future games. I suppose that's somewhat reassuring. We still have titles like Dragon Age 4 and a new Mass Effect to look forward to. But with BioWare's past few releases having fallen short of expectations, can they get their shit together and deliver a product that will remind us of the studio's glory days, back when deep, competent, and compelling writing and narrative took precedence? Furthermore, with EA still being so obsessed with games as service, can Dragon Age 4 avoid the pitfall of having its integrity marred by microtransactions? I'll remind you that Dragon Age Inquisition shipped with a tacked-on multiplayer mode featuring loot boxes, which was no doubt mandated by EA. Then again, EA does seem more conscious about not instigating another debacle like the Battlefront 2 controversy, with upcoming titles like Battlefield 5 and Anthem avoiding loot boxes outright. But history has proven that EA is constantly scheming for ways to nickel and dime players, and they'll have plenty of time to think about how to recurrently monetize Dragon Age 4. Speaking of EA, James wanted to dispel the conspiracy that EA forced BioWare into making a shared world online multiplayer game like Anthem, emphasizing that BioWare was always given a lot of control over the games they make. I wouldn't blame you if you were skeptical about such a claim. Hearing stories like how EA forced Visceral to make Battlefield Hardline against their will after Dead Space 3's failure, it's hard not to doubt claims that EA grants an appreciable level of creative autonomy. As far as Anthem is concerned, though, I do believe James when he says that Anthem was BioWare's idea, but I'd be hard-pressed to believe that monetization didn't come up during meetings with EA executives and that their stipulations didn't somehow influence aspects of the game's overall design and structure. EA's number one priority above all else is financial results, so you can bet your ass that to some extent they will influence projects under their umbrella as needed to that end. For example, progression is probably one aspect that EA keeps a very close eye on, as that is where microtransactions can be exploited to the fullest extent. Which is why I have little doubt that EA significantly influenced how progression works in Anthem, and I imagine that the publisher mandated progression be changed after the Battlefront 2 controversy. That's why Battlefield 5, Anthem, and the overhauled Battlefront 2 all follow the exact same microtransactions model. No loot boxes, cosmetic only, and items can also be earned through gameplay. Following up on EA, Game Informer asked James to comment on theories that BioWare will shut down if Anthem fails, in light of Andromeda's underwhelming performance and EA's reputation of closing down studios. James denied such notions outright, saying that he thinks EA is looking for BioWare to be a long-term part of the company, that EA respects what BioWare brings to it, and that even if Anthem doesn't do well, it won't be the end of BioWare, stating that failure will be a chance for the studio to learn some lessons and apply them to their next game. I'm sorry, but in light of all that's happened, I find this particular response to be either incredibly naive or complete bullshit. Did James forget that EA's knee-jerk reaction to Andromeda's underwhelming launch was to immediately scale down and dissolve BioWare Montreal? Does that seem like the move of a publisher who respects what their studios bring to it, or who think about them being a long-term part of the company? Given Bioware Montreal was axed before they got a chance to learn some lessons and apply it to their next game, do they really expect it'll be much different for Bioware Edmonton if Anthem flops? Maybe he knows something that I don't, but the fact that he keeps saying "I think" gives me the impression that he's not 100% certain about what he's saying. Not to mention that Jason Schrader's investigative article about pressure mounting at Bioware amidst Anthem's development tells a completely different story. One excerpt reads, quote, "As one developer told me, there's a belief that if Anthem doesn't live up to EA's expectations, Bioware will look very different in the future, especially after the disappointment of Mass Effect Andromeda led to EA absorbing Bioware Montreal into the Studio EA motive." Now that seems like a more accurate assessment of Bioware's situation and the mood within the studio. How would anyone working at Bioware not be on edge after what happened with Bioware Montreal, or considering EA's history of serial killing acquired studios? Finally, the last relevant portion of the interview saw James answering whether the Frostbite engine has developed to a point where Bioware can execute their ideas without being technically hampered. James responded that while Bioware did struggle with the engine early on, now that the team has so much more experience with it, he doesn't think it'll be an issue. At least that part seems more believable. Anthem does look like it's getting a lot of mileage out of Frostbite at a glance, though we'll obviously have to wait until launch before we can say for sure how well the engine handles a game like Anthem. Let's not kid ourselves here though, Frostbite has always proven to be excruciating to deal with for Bioware employees. But it's good to know that things are getting better on that front. Hopefully it'll be indication that upcoming projects like Dragon Age 4 and the next Mass Effect won't suffer from technical mishaps like Andromeda did. So there you have it, folks, everything James had to say about his departure from Bioware and his thoughts on the studio's current state. The rest of the interview is about James' future aspirations to create stories for the Dungeons & Dragons tabletop game, so I won't bother going through that. Overall, the feeling that I get is that his responses were a combination of half-truths and half-lies. But these are just one man's thoughts and opinions. I'd love to hear what your take is on everything James had to say in the comments below. With that, I would like to end this news update. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoy my content and would like to support this channel directly, consider donating on Patreon. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out!